Welcome, everyone. I know people are still joining, and if you'd like to kind of give us a quick introduction, just feel free to use the chat. Tell us your name, where you're from, and we'll kind of get going in about 3:05. Oh, thank you, Amanda. So it looks like chat function is disabled on your end. My apology. I think it's a little too late to fix that at this point. So we'll hold on to the introduction part, but if you have any questions for our guest speakers for our session, feel free to use the Q&A function. Any short questions or any questions that we can address during the presentations, we will do that. So thank you everybody for joining. We're gonna just give a couple more minutes. We actually have a quite large crowd expected today, so we'll just give us a couple more minutes. Thank you. Amy, should we go ahead?
Yep, that sounds great. Welcome, everybody. I would like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Amy Drescher, and I am chair of the AERA SIG for NAEP Studies. So I would like to welcome you to this webinar. We're very happy to be hosting this webinar today in collaboration with the AERA Indigenous Peoples of the Americas SIG. So thank you all who are members of that SIG. And the reason that we are collaborating on this is the important topic of the National Indian Education Study and the NIES study. And so, Jasmine, if you just want to go to the next slide where I think we have the pictures of our panelists. We have a stellar panel here today. So we have Jamie Deaton from NCES, who is the NIES project director at NCES. We have Crystal Moore from the Office of Indian Education, Susan Faircloth from Colorado State University, and JD Lopez from the University of Arizona. So we'd just like to welcome all of our panelists. As Jasmine said, if anybody would like to, we hope to have some Q&A. So feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A section. And without further ado, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Thank you very much, everyone. And really happy to be here with you today for this session showcasing the National Indian Education Study, or NIS for short. So before giving a very brief overview of the study, I wanted to thank my three colleagues for joining today and serving as panelists, especially the Office of Indian Education, who funds the study, and our entire NIS technical review panel who guides our work. And I work for the National Center for Education Statistics, more specifically within the assessments division. And within this division, we have a wealth of experience related to assessments. But for NIES to be effective and meaningful, it needs to be informed by individuals who have a wealth of experience related to American Indian and/or Alaska Native education, such as Dr. Moore, Dr. Faircloth, and Dr. Lopez. NIES, which was first administered in 2005, is the largest nationally representative data collection of American Indian and Alaska Native students. It is conducted through the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, and reports academic performance of students in reading and mathematics in grades 4 and 8. The reading and mathematics assessments are something all students take, not just American Indian and Alaska Native students. NIS, however, also includes a survey specific to American Indian and Alaska Native students, as well as their teachers and their school administrators. And the survey focus is on Native language and culture. And we keep our NAEP reading and mathematics test questions secure, so we can use these again over time and best measure trend over time. NIS survey questions, in contrast, though, are publicly posted prior to the study being conducted. They're posted on our website today, and they're always accessible and open for others to view. Through NIS, we report data by school type for 3 mutually exclusive categories, and those are low-density public schools, high-density public schools, and BIE schools. Low-density public schools are schools in which have 25% or fewer American Indians, Alaska Natives, which are probably the most common experience of our Native students. High-density public schools are those that have 25% or more American Indian, Alaska Natives, as well as BIE schools, or Bureau of Indian Education schools. And the last time the study was administered in 2019, we also featured American Indian, Alaska Native state-specific data for 15 states overall. That said, it's critical to note that every student from every state contributes to overall to a host of other subgroup results. And within National Center for Education Statistics reports, not just NAEP or NIS, when a subgroup is too small to report, you often see a dash instead of data. And a primary goal of NIS since the program began in 2005 is, whenever possible, to replace that dash with data, to have subgroup reporting, and to really showcase American Indians, Alaska Natives, not as one group, but to portray and showcase the diversity of these students and experiences of these students whenever possible, as much as possible. And with that, we can go on to the next slide. And just put a couple of NIS resources, including our website, where the surveys are available, the NIS 2019 report, as well as setting the context, that was authored by our technical review panel, and Dr. Faircloth will talk about it more during the presentation. And Jasmine, if maybe we could put those links in the chat too, that would be helpful for our participants today. And with that, let me turn it over to our next presenter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Deaton. My name is Crystal Moore. I currently serve as the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Indian Education Formula Team Supervisory Group Leader. So we fund about $110 million worth of grants to K-12, pre-K to 12 schools throughout the U.S. on an annual basis under the Office of Indian Ed. First, I want to thank my colleagues on this panel, Dr. Deaton, Dr. Faircloth, and Dr. Jameson Lopez, for inviting me and into this esteemed group. So thank you. I am specifically here today to give you a brief overview of the OIE formula program's GEPRA measures, which is the Government Performance Results Act, critical to our program, required statutorily, as well as our annual performance reporting and the intersections with NAEP and the NIES study. So I am passionate about using data to empower American Indian, Alaska Native pre-K to 20 education. a long history, done some work with both the IPA as well as the NAEP Studies SIG, roughly about 10 years ago. So thrilled to be joining you today in this conversation. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight some folks that are critical to the work we do within the Office of Indian Education. It is a lot of work. It's really thoughtful and painstaking, heartfelt work. And so it requires a significant team, of course. And our leadership for the Office of Indian Ed, we're under the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education under the U.S. Department of Ed. And so our Deputy Assistant Secretary is Ms. Ruth Ryder. She was our acting director for a period of time a couple of years ago. And then under her, we have Mr. Julian Grow Jr. He is a Kiowa and Comanche tribal citizen. And he currently serves as our director for the past roughly 2.5 years. And then you have myself reporting to him as the supervisory program officer, as well as the group leader. So, and I've been in this role for roughly 3 years. Next slide, please. I first want to highlight, this is probably the broad sweep overview, the biggest highlight of our overall program. It gives you some good data on how we fund comprehensive programs, and the programs we fund are designed to meet the unique cultural, language, and educational needs of American Indian and Alaskan Native students, and ensure that all students also are supported in meeting the challenging state academic standards. So we're a hybrid of both culture and academics with a focus on language. And so to continue with our SY22-23 OIE Formula Award Overview, you can see on your screen our state map. We publish these annually. And they do go, we have 2 websites. We have a more kind of a formal website that is under the Office of Indian Ed and Ed's departmental website. And then we also have a more dynamic page. So that's more of a technical assistance page under our community of practice, which if you've had a formula grant or work with a formula grant, you're quite familiar because all of our tutorials, everything goes there. So this state award map gets updated on both. And it shows you the total state allocation or the allocation for each state, shows you the number of grantees per state, as well as the Indian student count on each of the slides. Again, we have almost $110 million. We serve 1,276 grantees as of 22. That number goes up and down a little bit, but it stays anywhere from 1,275-ish to about 1,300. And we cover about 500,000 students. So it's really impactful work. We take it extremely seriously. And that's part of the reason we fund this study under Dr. Deaton's stewardship, as well as the TRP. So next slide, please. Quickly, and I'm going to quickly breeze through some of these slides. I just wanted to give you, I know that there's a lot of folks on this call that deal with solid data. So I wanted to give you some data to work with from our program. And this is the our formula our award overview. And so you see here that the majority of folks that we grant to are local education agencies, aka school districts throughout the various states. And that was for this year, 1,088 of our grantee pool. We also fund bureau and grant contract schools. So this would be tribes that contract with the Bureau of Indian Education under the Department of Interior and the BIE, or Bureau of Indian Education, but they have a contract. So we have several of those entities that do that work. And then we have straight bureau operated schools. So they are completely operated, managed by the BIE. We have some LEA consortiums. A few of those, you'll see 27. So these are LEAs that decided to team up and file one application with multiple LEAs on that application. And then tribes applying in lieu of LEAs. We have a few of those as well. So next slide, please. Again, I highlighted at the beginning slide that we're going to talk about a little bit about high-level overview of the APR and the GEPRA. So our grantees are required to file an annual performance report, aka an APR. That is per our Education Department General Administration regulations. or EDGAR. And from that APR data, we then populate our GEPRA measures annual reporting, which then feeds into, and this is a quick run through, there's a lot of detail underneath all of what I'm saying, but APR, we get the data from the grantees of how their grant went based on the objectives they identified. We then use that data to report out to Congress and the rest of the Department of Ed of how our grantees did based on our GEPRA measures, dealing with culture and language and academics, as I said earlier. So we produce a compiled list of an annual GEPRA report, again, that goes up to Congress to justify our funding or congressional justification. All right, next slide, please. Here, as of 2020, we started changing our setup a little bit. So based on my limited, not expansive, but limited work with the NAEP Studies SIG as well as IPA SIG, in touching in with the NIES, I knew how critical it was to have a crosswalk between what our grantees are doing as well as what is being reported out on the NIES. So we pre-fill as of 2020 the results of the NIES on their APRs. So as a communication support tool for the NIES team, we pre-fill this data on their APR as a crosswalk between the NIES as well as the APR for our OIE formula grants. And you can see the items we've chosen to pre-fill the data results for from the NIES onto our APRs. Okay, next slide, please. I also wanted to give you some more kind of in-depth. I'm not going to go through each of these data points one by one, but I wanted to give you at least a screenshot of some of the data that gets reported up under the APR, or that we take in from the APR and then gets reported up through the GEPRA. So, and this is again based on our NAEP reading scores, which are pre-filled on our APRs. And so you can kind of see the trends over the years. We do track all this data, and so does the rest of the U.S. Department of Education. But we base these reports on goals and objectives aligning to the core mission of our department, which is the cultural and academic intersections. So I'll give you a minute to just look through that. Again, 4th and 8th grade reading on the NAEP is what you'll see on this screen. And we'll provide these slides at the end so you can dig a little bit more into this data. And I'm also happy to answer questions afterward or even following with email. All right, next slide, please. Also wanted to give you same data, but this is math, similar data, but this is the math version. So 4th and 8th grade NAEP scores pre-filled onto the APRs. So our grantees, all of our 1,300 approximate grantees each year are seeing this data populated on their APR and hopefully are using it as a cross comparison to the data that they're producing within their school district. So they can compare the part to the whole type. All right, next slide. And then lastly, we also check the state assessment achievement scores, and what you see on the screen is the state results that we get from the EdFacts team. And this also gets pre-filled on the APR for our grantees as they're reporting their own data up. As of 2020, we also added a space for them to provide their own localized benchmark data. And some do, it's optional, they aren't required to, but it's certainly helpful to give us a bigger picture of what's happening in the LEAs in their benchmark data, especially due to COVID, when some of the districts, the states weren't doing their state testing due to the COVID flexibilities. Next slide, please. And then we have here the last data set, which is our high school graduation rates. This is critical for a lot of our grantees, and just measuring how our American Indian Alaska Native are doing as compared to other non-AIAN, as well as their goals versus their actual. So here's some of that data as well. And this is a 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate. And that's it for my portion of this. I just wanted to give you a kind of an overview of what we do, how we're doing it, how we've been adjusting to kind of bridge the previous gaps between the NIES, the NAEP data, as well as what we're doing in OIE formula, APR, and GEPRA data. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next presenter.
So good afternoon. My name is Susan Faircloth, and I'm the director of the School of Education at Colorado State University. And as luck would have it, I think I'm having a bit of technical difficulty as I'm trying to share my screen. So hopefully it will show. So if you'll give me one moment. Okay. So thank you again. I'm Susan Faircloth, and as I said, I am the director of the School of Education at Colorado State University, and I'm also a professor of educational leadership and a member of the Kahari tribe of the eastern part of North Carolina. I've had the honor of serving as the chair of the technical review panel of the National Indian Education Study for the past several years. And I also have the distinction of being one of the original members of the technical review panel that has been with the panel since it started back in the early 2000s. But I'd like to thank Dr. Moore and Dr. Deaton for setting up the presentation thus far, and then look forward to hearing from Dr. Lopez and the comments that he has to offer. But before I begin talking about setting the context for the National Indian Education Study, I'd like to take a moment and give honor and recognition to the lands on which I'm joining this webinar today. I have the honor of living and working on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Arapaho nations and peoples. And I think given the focus of this work around American Indian and Alaska Native education, it's particularly important to contextualize this work within the lands, communities, and peoples with whom and for whom we're working. So the focus of my section of today's webinar is talking about a document that is titled Setting the Context. And there will be a slide that I'll share with the group after the presentation that includes a link to the Setting the Context document. And as Dr. Deaton referenced earlier, that Setting the Context document is written by members of the technical review panel. And if you're able to go to either the back page of the National Indian Education Study from 2019, or if you're able to access the Setting the Context document, you'll be able to see a list of all of the technical review panel members. It's also critically important to give recognition to those members of the technical review panel who serve in a volunteer capacity to help guide and shape the design and conduct of the National Indian Education Study. The members of the technical review panel come from a variety of different backgrounds and areas of expertise. It includes educators, researchers, community members, and others with experience in the education of American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth. And you'll see in both of those documents, in both the National Indian Education Study publication and the Setting the Context document, that we tend to abbreviate American Indian Alaska Native as AIAN. So just so that everybody is clear on that. And then we abbreviate the National Indian Education Study and refer to it as the NIES or the NIES. So again, this panel of experts is critically important to the design, the implementation, and ultimately the analysis of data from the National Indian Education Study. The Setting the Context document, which is available at the link that's on this slide, which we'll also share with you. You might wonder, why is it important to have a Setting the Context document in addition to the National Indian Education Study document? So I'll speak to that for a moment. The question has come up, what was the impetus or the reason for this document? As members of the technical review panel, many of us felt very strongly that those variables that were missing from the National Indian Education Study were just as important as the variables that we're able to include within the design and conduct and analysis of the National Indian Education Study, and also as important as those data that we're able to collect and analyze from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is that sister or brother component to the National Indian Education Study. And so after years of conversation with the Office of Indian Education, the National Center for Education Statistics, and the Educational Testing Service, which all work together in the design, conduct, and analysis of the NIES, we came to the agreement a few years ago that we, the members of the technical review panel, would be able to publish a counter document or a companion document to the National Indian Education Study. And this is what we reference or refer to as the Setting the Context document. In that document, again, we recognize the importance of those variables, particularly those contextual and historical variables that are missing from the NIES and from the NAEP. And in writing these Setting the Context documents, which there are currently 2 of these documents, our goal is to reiterate the importance of context in understanding and responding to the educational conditions and academic outcomes of American Indian and Alaska Native students in public and BIE operated, BIE being the Bureau of Indian Education, operated and funded schools. I'll say one other thing before I talk about the contextual and historical factors that are addressed within this study. And this goes back to the question of why we're publishing a separate document. I think it's important to acknowledge that we, as the technical review panel, are the authors of the Setting the Context document. And we do that somewhat independently from the funders, from the Office of Indian Ed, from the National Centers for Educational Statistics, and from the Educational Testing Service. So we're not speaking on behalf of those federal agencies, but we're speaking as experts, as Native peoples, as parents, as community members, as researchers, as educators. And so I think it's critically important to make that distinction. So the focus or the foci of the Setting the Context document really revolves around a set of contextual and historical factors, including, first and foremost, a recognition of the importance of the trust responsibility for American Indian and Alaska Native education. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, American Indians and Alaska Natives have a unique socio-political, historical, legal relationship with the federal government. That relationship really rests within a set of treaties that have both been honored and dishonored throughout the history of the United States and the relationship between the U.S. government and Native nations. Because of those treaties, there is a promise from the U.S. government to provide for the health, education, and welfare of American Indian and Alaska Native citizens, including our children and youth. And that is a unique responsibility that we don't see in other racial ethnic groups across the nation. If we think about children and youth with disabilities, there is a federal requirement to provide education. And we know that the federal government also provides education for the children and dependents of members of the Department of Defense and the various military service units. So this really puts us into a unique situation that says the United States government has both a moral and a legal and an ethical obligation to provide education for American Indians and Alaska Natives. The information that we're able to gain from the National Indian Education Study provides data to help ensure or to help guide educators in a variety of different school types in providing both academically appropriate and culturally relevant and responsive education to our children and youth. Again, coming under that umbrella of trust responsibility for education. Within this document, we also speak to the relationship between American Indian, Alaska Native parents, families, communities, and schools. And we believe strongly as a technical review panel that the education of our children is not only the responsibility of the federal government, but that our families and communities and tribes, tribal nations should be intimately involved in the education of our children and youth. We also recognize in this document the important role of schooling in what many of us would argue is not only the historical, but ongoing attempts at assimilation and acculturation of Native peoples. And so again, the information that is provided in the NIES and that we underscore in the Setting the Context document really speaks to what we need to do to be addressing both the past and current attempts at assimilation and acculturation. We also speak to the diversity of Native languages and cultures. We know that there are more than 600 federally and state recognized American Indian tribes, tribal nations, and Alaska Native groups across the United States. We also know that there are approximately 200 different Native languages that are spoken to some degree of fluency, with many of those languages only having a small number of Native or fluent speakers still remaining. We also speak to the recruitment, hiring, and retention of Native teachers and school leaders, and we recognize again the critical importance of our children and our youth being able to see educators, not only classroom educators, but school leaders who look like them not only physically, but who look like them culturally, who understand the importance of language and culture and how language and culture both impact and are impacted by formal and informal education. We also address concerns around quality of instruction. And if you look at the data that are available through the NIES and through the NAEP, what you should see is that we ask a number of questions. We're limited by the number of questions that we can ask and the amount of time or the demand for time that we're placing on our respondents. And so our questions don't always get at quality of instruction. They ask about types of instruction. They ask about the amount of instruction. But we as a technical review panel recognize that something that's missing from the NIES and something that requires additional exploration is a deep dive into the quality of instruction that American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth are receiving. We also speak to the need for real and meaningful tribal consultation. And tribal consultation not being, let's just go talk to a tribe and then continue to do what we've always been doing, but really going back to those federal definitions of what tribal consultation mean, and this legal and political requirement to engage tribes in real, meaningful, and ongoing consultation, collaboration, and conversation around the education of our children and youth. And then finally, we recognize that there are limitations of those data that are available from the NIES and from the NAEP. There are limitations around the ability of us as analyzers, right, as data analyzers, to be able to suggest causality or causation based on the available variables. So I want to go back just one moment and really focus on this slide, which demonstrates to us the trilateral responsibility for American Indian education. Because as a technical review panel, we speak to this responsibility at almost every meeting that we have. And we hope that this responsibility comes across clearly in the Setting the Context document. This particular diagram was actually developed by a colleague and a member of the technical review panel, Dr. Marty Reinhardt from Michigan. And what Dr. Reinhardt argues is that there is this trilateral responsibility that has overlap of tribes, tribal nations, the federal government, and the state. And so it's critically important to recognize and remember that even though there's tribal consultation and that the federal government has a trust responsibility for Indian education, that does not absolve or relieve states from the responsibility of educating American Indian and Alaska Native youth in culturally relevant and responsive ways. And again, that speaks to the investment that the Office of Indian Education has made and continues to make in supporting the design and implementation and analysis and sharing of data from the National Indian Education Study. If it were not for funding from the Office of Indian Education, this study would not be possible. So again, under this trilateral responsibility, it's important to remember that tribes retain the right to educate their or our citizens in the manner that they choose, in the manner that they deem to be appropriate and relevant. It goes back to that notion of self-determination and the right of tribes to be able to determine, right, not only the educational futures, but the cultural futures, political, social, economic, futures and well-being of their citizens. It's also important to remember that tribes retain the right to educate others about their tribes and tribal citizens. And we speak to this some in the NIES, where we ask our students and we ask teachers and educators who from the different Native tribes or Native communities are coming into your schools and teaching our students or working with our students, providing cultural activities, language instruction, and other types of instruction. And then finally, we recognize that if we actualize and honor and respect this trilateral responsibility for American Indian and Alaska Native education, that we will have stronger relationships, right? And we recognize that stronger relationships can and should exist between tribes, states, and federal governments. I'm wrapping up with just 2 more slides. This next to the last slide leaves you with a set of considerations for the use, for analysis and use of data from the NIES and from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, particularly those data for American Indian, Alaska Native children and youth. What we argue is that ensuring that American Indian and Alaska Native youth flourish both academically and culturally is critically important to the health and well-being of our tribes and tribal communities. We also know that Native languages and cultures potentially help to promote resiliency and future aspirations among Native youth. Unfortunately, data from the NIES indicates that students, American Indian, Alaska Native students in grade 4, when asked about how much they know about their American Indian tribe, 17% reported knowing nothing, right? And I'll say that again. Nearly 20% of our children who were surveyed and included in the latest iteration of the NIES reported knowing nothing about their tribes. So that speaks to this ongoing and urgent need to address the ways in which we not only educate our children about their tribes within our communities, but the way in which we do that within our educational, formal educational environments. We also know that the adoption and use of culturally relevant teaching and learning practices is critical to nurturing and maintaining resiliency, as well as richer learning experiences for our children and youth. Finally, on behalf of the technical review panel, I would like to say that we are committed, we as a technical review panel are committed to effective positive change for American Indian and Alaska Native students and the schools and staff who serve them. And we honor and we thank those who join us in this work on behalf of Native youth across this nation. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Dr. Lopez.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just thankful to be here. I'm happy to see all your brilliantly shining names in the participant list over here to the right. I wish I could see your faces, but that's all right. My name is JD Lopez. You call me Jameson. I'm from the Quezon Nation in Fort Yuma, California. I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. My parents, a little bit about my background. Actually, my parents were both worked for a small college called American Indian College, which was situated there in the valley. They raised me and my 2 older sisters in the north part of Phoenix in a predominantly white neighborhood, going back and forth from our reservation, like a lot of urban natives. So I got to go back to my community, which was about 3 hours away, at least once a month, and then spend summers there and whatnot. Today, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the uses of the NIES. If we could go to the next slide. One of the things, and I promise not to talk too much on a lot of the different items on here, but I also work at University of Arizona. I'm faculty over there. I teach our introduction to statistics, factor analysis classes. I teach Indigenous statistics and survey methods. And so a lot of what I do within my own research is related to just really wanting to carry out that legacy that my parents kind of put in my own life of just creating access to natives for higher education through education as a way to help give back to our tribal communities and build our nations. And so the work and the things that I'm talking about today, it still has that kind of undertone to what I do and what I want to present on right now. So One of the things that I find unique about the NIES study in general is just this idea is that it moves beyond just like a checkbox. As you all know, when we look at different types of surveys, whether it be federally, nationally, state, a lot of times when we look at the data that's American Indian or Alaska Native, it's literally just like, all right, check a box, and then we're grouped into a whole nother section. There could be more complicated issues if you're multiracial, if you're multi-tribal, and so forth. But at that most basic level, a lot of folks just write, American Indian, check that box, and they move on to it. Well, within a lot of the research that we see within Indian country, especially in the federal level, there's a lot of inconsistencies, or we see a lot of problems like the standard errors are really large, or we see really biased estimates within the data itself. And one of the things that we believe it's attributed to is this idea that folks may be marking that they're Native when in reality, they may not have that same cultural experience as other Native American groups. And so we also have issues, if we think about the college admission scandals of folks writing that they're Native. We could also see it within some of the academic circles. We could see ethnic fraud being committed among, even politicians for that matter, senators, not to call anyone out, but, and I'm not here today to talk about necessarily who's Native and who's not Native, but I'm here to say there's ways that we're able to look at the actual experience of these individuals and how they've interrogated their indigeneity at a young age. And so if you look at some of the student level data, there's items that are on like Native history, traditions, ways of life, customs, and how, and some of those questions are like, how do you go to Native ceremonies and gatherings? Who taught you most of what you know about issues today that are important to Native people? Who taught you most of what you know about in a Native language in itself? And the reason why it's important to think about this in the context of Indigenous communities, and Dr. Faircloth, I appreciate you alluding to it earlier too, is that there is over 600 federally recognized tribes and state recognized tribes, all with different varying aspects of their traditions, ceremonies, and so forth. And even then, it gets a little bit different when you're trying to disaggregate between urban, rural, city, natives that grow up on the shoulder, natives that grow up on the reservation and an urban community, and those experiences are quite different. I know for myself, and I'll share a quick story because I think we have a little bit of time. For myself, when I came to understand who I was as an Indigenous person, like I said, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood in the north part of the valley in Phoenix. I remember going to school and all these kids were talking about kind of their race and ethnicity. They were saying, I'm Italian, I'm German, and and so forth. I'm Dutch. And I remember everybody looked at me, being this kid, dark brown skin. They said, JD, what are you? And I looked around, looked at me, looked at my skin color, I looked to them, and I was the darkest person at the time, being 8 years old in school. And in my 8-year-old naiveness, I just said, well, I'm Black. And they were like, okay, and everybody accepted it. And I was like, okay. So for the rest of the day, I was saying that. And, again, I was 8 years old, like completely naive to anything. I was just the darkest person I had ever met. And I remember my teacher overheard me. She called my mother and she called my mom. And my mom said, my teacher said to my mom, JD's going around saying that he's African American, is he? And my mom kind of laughed and she was like, no, JD's Native American. I'll talk to him when he gets home. And so I remember getting off the bus. I'm in front of my house, going past our big ash tree that was right in front of our house, walking through the doors. And my mom was already sitting on the couch and she called me over and she was like, JD, come here. And I was like, okay, Mom, walking over there. And she's like, I have something to tell you. And I was like, what is it, Mom? She goes, JD, you're not Black. And I was like, what? I thoroughly enjoyed being African American those first 8 years of my life. And when that disappointment left me, of not knowing who I was or thinking I didn't know who I was, I asked my mom, well, what am I? And she goes, well, JD, you're Native American, you're Quetzan. And I was like, my eyes lit up again. And, I had thought all these these things that I've seen as a kid growing up watching, these problematic kind of John Wayne movies and Westerns and whatever it may be, was what it meant to be Native. Right away, took my mom's red lipstick, started painting my face and my chest and, cutting up her hibiscus tree in the back, making bows and arrows. But not realizing in reality that experience I had as an Indigenous urban Native growing up in the city was truly a Native experience in itself, of going back to my reservation, growing up in the city, and trying to interrogate who I was as just a Native kid and a child growing up. And I think about that in juxtaposition with my own kids. Even when we go back to our reservation, we used to stay with family, me and my sisters and my parents. But now, when the gaming industry came in the 80s and the early 90s, now all of a sudden we're staying at the casino. And so when my kids are like, hey, we love the reservation, we want to go back, we're always staying at a hotel now. And it's just such a different experience than what I had growing up as a kid. I've tried to take them out on the river with the canoe and go fishing. And, they're like, no, let's go back to the pool. We want to be in the lazy river. And I think about those different experiences we have. And it's not necessarily to say that someone is more Indigenous than the other person, or we grew up, but just that our experiences with our indigeneity has been different. And so when we're trying to capture those experiences within data, a lot of federal data sets don't give us that same opportunity to be able to capture that. Like I'll bring it back to that first point, is it's just like a checkbox. I'm American Indian, I'm Alaska Native, and it only goes so far. But when we're start to apply like some theoretical framings into it, there's a theory by Robert K. Thomas called the peoplehood paradigm. And it says the extent to which you belong to a particular people is related to the land, language, knowledges of ceremony, as well as kinship and your knowledge of who your family is. And, when we look at these items that we see within the NIES, it starts getting at some of those questions in a way that we could create composite variables, or we could start doing different types of factor scores that we could see what that relationship may be with some of these educational outcomes that we're looking at. If we could go to the next slide too. So some of the limitations that we do see within the NIES itself is the idea of the NIES sampling. Again, keeping in mind that we do have over 600 federally and state recognized tribes. The NIES doesn't include all of those different individual tribal communities. But again, it's an idea of like, we're able to get at that cultural experience. We're able to see a little bit. And the main one that I want to talk about here, though, is the outcomes. They're not always based in the values of the community. And so when we think about the NAEP and we think about the NIES and the most basic educational outcomes we're looking at in reading and math scores, we could consistently see over time that Natives have been either at the bottom or near the bottom of achievement. And it bothers me quite often, one, knowing, I don't know how the accuracy of the students who are marking that they're Native or not Native, but two is, are we using the same outcomes that we should be using when trying to measure the success of our Indigenous students? And the reason, I'll bring it back a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about this because in 1928, there was the Merriam Report that came out, and the Merriam Report was kind of this survey of just looking at Indigenous country in the 20s within the United States that talks about, education type data, health data, economic development, housing, and so forth. And in that education section, 90 plus years ago, they were talking about having more highly qualified teachers. They were talking about paying teachers more. They were talking about having culturally relevant education, not in those words, but just understanding like, hey, these kids need to be taught in a different way that we haven't been teaching, non-Native students. And in there also, they said we can't use the same standardized testing that we're using with Native students that we are using with non-Native students. It just, there's different types of outcomes, understanding that even back then, the standardized testing was biased in a sense of like, there was questions that some of our Native students didn't understand. You could think about, for example, there was a question about a boat, in the 1920s, and a lot of kids, Native kids during that time, didn't even know what a boat was. And so we fast forward almost 90 years or over 90 years, and we could see that we still have quite a bit of those same issues. And so the outcomes aren't necessarily focused on the values based in the community. And so one of the things that I've thought about, with this NIES data, and that's unique about it, a limitation, but also maybe an opportunity for it, is beginning to look at outcomes based on the values of the community. And Django Paris was the one that actually, Paris and Aline in 2016, they wrote about that in Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, about this idea of like, okay, the outcomes need to be based in the values of the community. And so if we were to base those values in the community, there's certain things that we can do, but there's also those limitations. One is that we can look at cultural experience as an outcome. How does reading and math scores, influence cultural experience for a lot of our Native students? And it's somewhat flipping the statistical model on its head, but it is putting an onus on being able to look at like, okay, here's a value based in an Indigenous community. But even then, I think it could go a little bit further of just including items that are relevant to our Native community as a whole, whether it be measuring things like giving back, as an educational outcome and so forth. But at the same time, I believe, like, I'm not also ignorant to the fact that we'll get rid of, reading and math scores or anything like that. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying, like, I think there's educational outcomes that we have an opportunity to measure here that haven't yet been included. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end right there, and I'll turn it back over to Jamie, and I appreciate your time and look forward to the question and answers. So.
Thank you so much to my fellow panelists for their presentations and their insights. So happy to turn over to discussions and questions, and we'll go from there.
So Jamie, we don't have any questions on the Q&A session, and I know we only have a few minutes left. Before I share any closing announcements, if any of our panelists have any kind of final words that they want to share with us.
One thing to kind of preview looking ahead that I will say is, so the next time the National Indian Education Study will be administered is in conjunction with the 2024 NAEP assessments. NAEP was conducted in 2022, and we released those results on October 24th of this year. And even though it did not have the NIS administration piece, we still had state level American Indian Alaska Native results for 7 states for both subjects, both grades, as well as data specific for Wyoming at grade 8 reading. Also wanted to thank kind of the NAEP family at large. One of the contractors we've worked with, Westat, has done a really good job over the years, whenever possible, getting American Indian Alaska Native data. We revised our sampling plan prior to the 2018 assessments. So for those national level assessments that have samples in the neighborhood of like 8,000, these days, starting with 2018 and beyond, we're able to get American Indian Alaska Native specific data.
Jamie, I would just also say, if I may, I really appreciate, Jameson problematizing. I always struggle with saying that word. My husband tells me we as academics have a tendency to make up words. But I appreciate you, JD, problematizing, some of the aspects of the questions as we currently ask them, right? And the limitations. And we also underscore those limitations in the setting, the context document. But I also want to say, in spite of those limitations, I hope that we can find ways to continue and maintain the commitment, the financial commitment to the design and conduct of the National Indian Education Study, because as we noted at the beginning of this session, this is currently the only nationally representative study that we have of American Indian and Alaska Native education. At one point, we had the Schools and Staffing Survey, which did an oversampling of individuals working with their schools and students. And so we don't have that. And so I know it's critically important for us to have these types of studies. And I also recognize limitations that the Office of Indian Education has with staffing And in spite of those limitations, the commitment of time and resources that they make to this important study. So that's one of the things that we've grappled with since the inception of the study is, I sit on the technical review panel, not only as a researcher, but as the mother. As I know, Dr. Moore is a mother of a little one and JD is a mother. And so I come to this work not only as a researcher and academic, but as a parent whose native child is impacted by the ways in which we educate and care for the hearts and minds of our children. And so these data, in spite of their limitations, are critically important. And I hope what I've really appreciated during my tenure as the chair of the technical review panel is I have seen the National Center for Education Statistics and our other contractors be more open to thinking about ways in which we can expand our data collection, helping us to work through those issues and questions around maintaining trend and the consequences of giving up trend so that we can add in new questions. And so I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the ways in which the different agencies have been responsive and also implore us all to think and do more and better for our children, because as we've also said throughout this webinar, our children are the heart and soul of our Native communities. And if we are failing to educate those children in culturally appropriate and relevant and caring ways, then the future health and security of our tribal nations and communities continues to be at risk. And so it's this delicate dance, right, of recognizing the limitations and continuing to partner to figure out ways in which we can collect data that best represents our children, youth, and communities. So I just continue to thank each of you for this ongoing partnership and really appreciate the NAEP SIG for giving us this opportunity to talk about these data. I think this is the first time in the 20 years, almost 20 years, that I've been on the technical review panel that we've had this opportunity. So really appreciate the sponsorship of the SIG and of the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas SIG for providing this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So we actually do have a couple of questions. I know you only have 3 minutes left, but I think, Jamie, I'll turn over to you to answer perhaps May's question. So there was a question about whether the questions are written in English and the native language of the tribe or nation, or whether the questions are only in English.
Sure. So for NAEP, and this is NAEP program-wide, we do offer Spanish translations, but we do not and are not able to write it in the native language of the students. So we do offer different accommodations on NAEP, which extends to NIES as well, such as extended time of testing. Generally we try to be as inclusive as possible, but there are, I would say, restrictions and challenges, both from a resources standpoint as well as a budgetary standpoint with that too.
Thank you. And we do have one more question for JD. We only have 2 minutes left, so I don't know if that will give you enough time to answer the question.
Sure. What's the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. So there was a question from Regina about if you could provide some examples of culturally relevant topics or items that you'd like to see on the assessment. And that seems like a little loaded question. So if you could give an example, or any other panelists, that would be great. And also we can provide our written responses along with the links and the video recordings when they're ready.
Yeah, one of the things that I've often thought about with a lot of our Native communities, and it's quite difficult to be able to come up with items that measure across all 600 or more than 600 individual tribes, especially when you're thinking about outcomes, because those outcomes are all going to be different based on those individual tribal communities in itself. And so it's difficult, but from what I've seen, just based in my own research, the literature, being and having been around Native communities most of my life, is I think about that concept of nation building and how we might measure that as an educational outcome, as many times our tribal communities are using education as a means to contribute towards nation building. And I think they also use that word giving back, but I think giving back is intertwined with nation building as a whole. And I think those even go back further into indigenous concepts, whether you want to call it this idea of protecting our communities. You know, we need education, we need social workers because we need to protect the Indian Child Welfare Act and our children. We need lawyers because we need to be able to protect our water rights. You know, we need farmers because we need to sustain our way of life. We need teachers because we need folks to be able to teach our children in that next generation. And all the means of that is this idea of education. And so I think about it in a post-secondary education context there, but I think thinking of ways how we might be able to measure that within a K-12 setting in the 4th and 8th grade, I think that would be a really interesting endeavor to embark on, you know, and I'm definitely not the sole expert in that, but I would definitely be interested in, you know, exploring some of those thoughts and ideas about what those variables and items could be that we could add in tandem with those reading and math scores that is based, you know, generally within the values of our Indigenous communities.
Thank you. So we are a minute over. So thank you so much for our panelists and our IPA SIG for the collaboration. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I did share a few links that may be relevant and helpful for you, but also I'll share all those resources along with the video recordings and the slides from our presenters when they're ready, and you will get the email notification once they're posted up on the website. So thank you everyone, and have a great holiday season. Thank you.